In 1861, America tore itself apart. Brothers became enemies. Cities turned into battlegrounds. Over 600,000 would die, not for foreign conquest, but over the soul of a nation. This is the story of the American Civil War, the founding of the United States, the seeds of a divided nation. The birth of the United States in 1776 marked the beginning of a bold experiment in self-government, grounded in Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and natural rights. However, from its very inception, the American Republic was a nation of paradoxes. The same men who declared all men are created equal also owned slaves. The structure of government they designed was one of carefully negotiated balances between large and small states, the federal government and state authority, liberty and order. But one fissure ran especially deep: slavery. The compromises and contradictions embedded in the nation's founding documents would later erupt into sectional conflict, secession, and civil war. The Declaration of Independence and the ideals of liberty. On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, primarily authored by Thomas Jefferson. Its opening lines have become immortal. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." These words signaled a revolutionary break from monarchy and a commitment to universal principles of liberty, equality, and individual rights. Yet in practice, these ideals were selectively applied. Jefferson himself was a slaveholder. Many of the signers owned enslaved people and did not see a contradiction between proclaiming freedom and maintaining human bondage. Still, the Declaration of Independence introduced enduring political concepts. Natural rights. Individuals possess rights by virtue of being human, not by government grant. Popular sovereignty. Legitimate power resides with the people, not kings or elites. Right of revolution. People have the right to overthrow unjust governments. These ideas resonated across the Atlantic world, inspiring revolutions in France, Haiti, and Latin America. In the United States, however, they created a troubling contradiction. How could a republic dedicated to liberty tolerate slavery? This contradiction became a growing source of tension, especially between the North, which would gradually move toward abolition, and the South, where slavery was deeply entrenched in the economy and culture. The U.S. Constitution and the Compromise on Slavery. After winning independence from Britain, the new nation faced internal disarray under the Articles of Confederation, a loose union that gave states nearly all power. To resolve this, delegates convened in Philadelphia in 1787 to create a stronger federal government, resulting in the U.S. Constitution. But crafting the Constitution required navigating sectional differences, especially on slavery. Though never explicitly using the word slavery, the Constitution made several crucial compromises that protected and legitimized the institution. 1. The Three-Fifths Compromise. Southern states demanded that their enslaved populations be counted toward representation in Congress. Northern delegates opposed counting people who had no rights or citizenship. The compromise counted each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for both taxation and representation. And Electoral College. This inflated Southern political power, allowing slaveholding presidents and pro-slavery legislation to dominate for decades. 2. The Fugitive Slave Clause, Article 4, Section 2. This clause required that enslaved people who escaped to free states shall be delivered up to their owners. It gave legal backing to the idea that enslaved people were property, and that states had to cooperate in preserving slavery, even if slavery was illegal within their own borders. 3. Protection of the slave trade until 1808. Article 1, Section 9 prevented Congress from banning the importation of slaves until 1808. Southern delegates insisted on this clause to ensure the transatlantic slave trade could continue for at least 20 more years. Federal versus state power, fragile foundations. One of the most contentious debates in early American politics was how to divide power between the federal government and the states, a debate that would evolve into the issue of states' rights, central to the Civil War. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, wanted a strong central government capable of managing national debt, regulating commerce, and maintaining order. The Anti-Federalists, including Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, feared centralized tyranny and defended state sovereignty. This division led to several foundational compromises and structures. A bicameral legislature. The Senate gave equal power to each state, regardless of population, while the House of Representatives reflected population size. The 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights, 1791, reserved powers not delegated to the federal government to the states, reinforcing their autonomy. Creation of a Supreme Court to interpret constitutional disputes, often involving federal versus state authority. Throughout the early republic, these tensions simmered. In the 1798 Alien and Sedition Acts, Jefferson and Madison responded with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which claimed states could nullify federal laws they deemed unconstitutional, a principle that would later fuel Southern secession. The nullification crisis of 1832, led by South Carolina, would revive this debate, asserting state power over federal tariffs. The founders never fully resolved the federal-state power divide. Instead, they built a system of compromise and ambiguity that left slavery's legal status and territorial expansion up for ongoing battle. The Northwest Ordinance and slavery's westward expansion. While the Constitution institutionalized slavery, another foundational document, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, hinted at a different future. Passed under the Articles of Confederation and reaffirmed under the Constitution, the ordinance set the terms for settling and governing the Northwest Territory, modern-day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. Key provisions included orderly expansion. The ordinance established how territories could become states, requiring population thresholds and guarantees of Republican government. Ban on slavery. Article 6 of the ordinance declared that there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the Northwest Territory. This was a significant precedent. It showed that Congress could regulate slavery in federal territories. It also signaled that new states might be free states, unsettling Southern slaveholders who feared being outnumbered and losing control in Congress. Yet the ordinance also created complications. Slaveholders moving into the Northwest Territory brought enslaved people anyway, and local authorities often turned a blind eye. Southern states argued that Congress had no right to restrict the expansion of slavery, a viewpoint that would resurface in the Missouri Compromise debates, 1820, and again in the 1850s with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Most critically, the Northwest Ordinance introduced the idea that the spread of slavery was a national issue, not just a regional or local one. Every new territory acquired by the U.S. would become a new battleground between pro- and anti-slavery factions. Early conflicts and factionalism. In the first decades of the new republic, political factions quickly formed around divergent visions of America. Federalists, Hamilton, Adams, favored commerce, banking, a strong federal government, and alignment with Britain. Democratic Republicans, Jefferson, Madison, advocated for agrarianism, states' rights, westward expansion, and a decentralized government. While these factions were not yet rigidly divided over slavery, geographic patterns began to emerge. Northern states moved toward gradual abolition, while Southern states tightened their grip on slave labor. Key developments included the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, passed by Congress, gave teeth to the Fugitive Slave Clause and sparked early tensions between free and slave states. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, a successful slave uprising, terrified white Southerners and hardened their attitudes toward any anti-slavery rhetoric. The emergence of free black communities in northern cities and early abolitionist societies laid the groundwork for an eventual anti-slavery movement. The founding generation hoped that slavery might wither away on its own. But instead of fading, it became more entrenched, especially with the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, which made slave labor exponentially more profitable in the South. Conclusion: a nation built on compromise and conflict. The founding of the United States was a remarkable achievement in political theory and governance. But it was also an enterprise deeply marked by moral compromise. The lofty ideals of the Declaration of Independence coexisted with the legal protections of human bondage enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. The early republic was torn between visions of liberty and realities of oppression, between the autonomy of states and the authority of a national government. The Northwest Ordinance demonstrated that the issue of slavery would haunt every effort to expand the nation. The Constitution's compromises ensured that slavery would remain at the center of American political life, giving it legitimacy and protection until the sectional crisis could no longer be contained. These founding contradictions did not cause the Civil War by themselves, but they laid the structural and ideological groundwork for the conflicts that would eventually erupt. In their attempt to create a more perfect union, the founders built a republic that was already divided, and the cost of holding that union together would be paid in blood nearly a century later. Rise of sectionalism, North versus South, a house divided. By the early 19th century, the United States was growing rapidly in size, population, and ambition. But as the country expanded westward and developed economically, stark divisions began to emerge between its two major regions, the industrializing North and the agrarian, slave-dependent South. These divisions were not merely economic, but extended into politics, culture, and ideology. Over time, what began as regional differences hardened into sectionalism, a loyalty to one's region rather than to the nation as a whole. This rise in sectionalism would gradually unravel the fragile compromises of the founding era and push the country towards civil war. Economic divergence, industrial North versus agrarian South. The North and South followed vastly different economic paths after the American Revolution. The North, industry and wage labor. By the early 1800s, the North was undergoing a profound transformation through the Industrial Revolution. Factories, especially in New England and the mid-Atlantic states, were producing textiles, tools, and manufactured goods. Cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia became centers of finance, shipping, and commerce. A growing class of wage laborers worked in mills and factories, often under poor conditions but without slavery. A diversified economy and growing infrastructure, canals, railroads, telegraphs, helped integrate the North into a national and increasingly global market. The South, agriculture and slavery. The South remained heavily agrarian, depending on plantation agriculture for its wealth. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made cotton the dominant cash crop, especially in the Deep South. Southern elites relied on a vast system of enslaved labor to maintain the profitability of their plantations. Unlike the North, the South remained rural, with fewer cities and limited industrial development. Wealth and power in the South were concentrated in the hands of a small planter aristocracy, which fiercely defended slavery as essential to their economic and social order. This economic divergence created competing interests. The North supported modernization, wage labor, and internal improvements, while the South resisted changes that might threaten their plantation economy and slave system. Cultural and social differences. Beyond economics, the North and South developed distinct social values, educational priorities, and cultural identities. North, reform and progress. The North saw a surge in public education, urbanization, and immigration. The Second Great Awakening inspired numerous reform movements, including abolitionism, temperance, and women's rights. Northern society, while far from egalitarian, embraced the idea of social mobility, hard work, and moral progress. Abolitionists, especially in New England, began to see slavery not just as a Southern issue, but a national moral crisis. South. Tradition and hierarchy. Southern society was rooted in tradition, honor, and a rigid racial hierarchy. Education was less widespread, and many poor whites had limited access to schooling. Southern elites promoted the idea that slavery was not a moral evil, but a positive good, essential to civilization and white supremacy. Religion in the South became more aligned with pro-slavery interpretations of Christianity, in contrast to the more reformist evangelicalism in the North. These cultural differences shaped how each region viewed the future of the nation. The North increasingly saw the South's dependence on slavery as backward and unjust, while the South saw Northern reformers as dangerous radicals threatening their way of life. Tariffs, banking, and internal improvements. While slavery was the core issue underlying sectionalism, debates over economic policy further widened the rift between North and South. Tariffs. The federal government imposed protective tariffs to shield Northern manufacturers from foreign competition. Tariffs like the Tariff of Abominations, 1828, were deeply unpopular in the South, which relied on imported goods and feared retaliatory tariffs against their cotton exports. Southern leaders viewed high tariffs as a form of economic exploitation, where the federal government served Northern industrial interests at the South's expense. Banking. The North generally supported a national bank to stabilize currency and encourage economic development. The South, especially Andrew Jackson and his supporters, distrusted central banking as an elite conspiracy and a threat to agrarian independence. The Bank War of the 1830s was a symbolic struggle between North and South over economic control and class power. Internal improvements. The North supported federally funded infrastructure projects, canals, educational projects, canashes, and educational improvements, railroads, roads, to support commerce and connect markets. The South often opposed such measures, arguing that they favored the North and exceeded the federal government's constitutional powers. When Southern states were asked to help fund projects that would primarily benefit Northern industry, resistance was fierce. Together, these disputes revealed a deeper issue: the South's fear of being economically and politically dominated by a more populous, rapidly modernizing North. Southern fears of losing political dominance. As the North's population and economic power grew, the balance of power in Congress began to tilt. The South, once politically dominant, began to see itself as a besieged minority, increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Political balance in the Senate. The South's power had long been protected by the Senate, where each state had equal representation. As new states joined the Union, fierce debates erupted over whether they would be free or slave states. The South feared that if the North gained a Senate majority, it would eventually legislate slavery out of existence. The House and Electoral College. The North's growing population gave it an advantage in the House of Representatives and Electoral College. Southern leaders believed their ability to elect sympathetic presidents was slipping, especially as anti-slavery voices gained ground in the North. The rise of abolitionism. By the 1830s, abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass were publishing powerful critiques of slavery. Southern newspapers and politicians denounced these efforts as incitement to rebellion and terrorism. The Gag Rule in Congress, 1836 to 1844, which banned discussion of abolitionist petitions, showed how fragile the political consensus had become. The fear of a hostile federal government. The South's worst nightmare was a federal government. Conclusion: sectionalism becomes a crisis. By the 1840s and 1850s, sectionalism had become more than a difference of opinion. It was a full-blown political and cultural crisis. The North and South no longer saw each other as mere rivals, but as opposing civilizations. Each side believed its way of life was under threat from the other. The North believed in a future of free labor, industrial growth, and expanding democracy. The South believed in preserving its agrarian economy, racial hierarchy, and the right to own human beings. As these visions collided in Congress, in newspapers, and in public sentiment, the American experiment in unity became increasingly unstable. Sectionalism was not just a disagreement over policy. It was a profound clash of identities, values, and visions for the future of the United States. The Civil War would be the violent resolution of a conflict that had been building since the country's founding. The institution of slavery, a nation built on bondage. Slavery was not a Southern anomaly. It was a foundational element of the American economy and society from colonial times through the mid-19th century. While the founders had hoped the institution would fade, it instead expanded rapidly, especially after technological innovations made slave labor even more profitable. As slavery grew more entrenched, it also became more brutal, sparking fierce resistance from both the enslaved and those committed to their liberation. The institution of slavery was not only an economic system, but a moral battleground that would ultimately divide the country and lead it toward war. Slavery's growth after the cotton gin. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 transformed Southern agriculture and ensured the survival and explosive growth of slavery in the United States. The cotton boom. The cotton gin made it dramatically easier to separate cotton fibers from seeds, turning cotton into a highly profitable crop. Demand for king cotton soared, both domestically and abroad, especially in British textile mills. Southern states such as Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas became new frontiers of cotton cultivation, leading to what became known as the Cotton Kingdom. Expansion of slavery. As cotton plantations spread, so too did the demand for enslaved laborers. The domestic slave trade expanded massively. More than 1 million enslaved people were forcibly relocated from the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, to the Deep South. Families were torn apart in slave auctions, as enslaved people were treated as commodities to be bought, sold, or mortgaged. By 1860, over 4 million enslaved African Americans lived in the United States, nearly 1 in 3 Southerners. This economic expansion solidified the South's dependence on slavery and created an elite planter class with a vested interest in preserving and expanding the institution at all costs. Slave codes and daily life under slavery. The life of an enslaved person was characterized by brutality, control, and constant surveillance. To maintain the system, Southern states enforced slave codes, laws designed to restrict every aspect of an enslaved person's life. Legal and physical oppression. Enslaved people could not own property, enter contracts, testify against whites, legally marry, or learn to read and write. Any form of resistance, whether escape, disobedience, or self-defense, could be met with severe punishment: whipping, branding, imprisonment, or execution. Patrols and militias monitored plantations and towns to catch runaways and suppress revolts. Daily life and labor. Most enslaved people worked from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, primarily in cotton, sugar, and tobacco fields. Others were domestic workers, blacksmiths, carpenters, or skilled artisans, often working in harsh conditions with no rights or compensation. Living conditions were poor: crowded cabins, inadequate food, minimal clothing, and frequent abuse. Resistance and culture. Despite the oppression, enslaved people developed rich cultural, spiritual, and familial traditions. Spirituals and songs encoded messages of resistance and hope. Religion, particularly Christianity, was a source of both solace and subversion. Preachers like Nat Turner interpreted the Bible as a call to resist injustice. Family bonds, while constantly under threat from sale and separation, were cherished and carefully preserved. Even in bondage, enslaved people asserted their humanity and resilience, undermining pro-slavery arguments that they were content or inferior. The abolitionist movement, voices of conscience. As slavery grew in the South, so too did opposition in the North. A diverse group of abolitionists emerged in the early 19th century, committed to ending slavery through moral persuasion, political action, and public protest. William Lloyd Garrison. In 1831, Garrison began publishing The Liberator, a fiery anti-slavery newspaper. He called for the immediate and uncompensated emancipation of all enslaved people. Garrison's uncompromising stance and eloquent rhetoric electrified abolitionist circles and outraged Southern slaveholders. He also co-founded the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833, one of the most important abolitionist organizations of the period. Frederick Douglass. Born into slavery in Maryland, Douglass escaped in 1838 and became one of the movement's most powerful orators and writers. His 1845 autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, became a bestseller and exposed the cruelty of slave. Douglass advocated for abolition not only as a moral imperative, but as a matter of American constitutional justice. He rejected gradualism and colonization, insisting that formerly enslaved people should be full citizens of the Republic. The Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, daughters of a South Carolina slaveholder, became some of the first Southern white women to speak publicly against slavery. They moved north and joined abolitionist circles, linking the fight against slavery with the emerging women's rights movement. Their activism challenged both the institution of slavery and the patriarchal norms of 19th century America. These figures, and many others, formed a national network of lecturers, petitioners, writers, and organizers, making slavery not just a Southern concern, but a national crisis of conscience. Literature and its influence. Uncle Tom's Cabin. In 1852, the publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, shook the nation and galvanized the anti-slavery cause. A moral wake-up call. Stowe, a Northern white woman, wrote the novel in response to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required Northerners to return runaway slaves to the South. Uncle Tom's Cabin depicted the horrors of slavery through vivid characters and emotional storytelling, especially the spiritual strength of the enslaved Uncle Tom and the cruelty of slaveholders. Immediate impact. The novel sold over 300,000 copies in its first year and became an international sensation. It personalized slavery for Northern readers. many of whom had never seen slavery firsthand. The book outraged Southerners, who dismissed it as inaccurate propaganda and banned it in many states. Legacy. The novel had a profound cultural impact, helping to shift public opinion and energize the abolitionist movement. When President Lincoln met Stowe during the Civil War, he reportedly said, "So you're the little lady who started this great war." While apocryphal, the quote reflects the enormous influence of literature in shaping national consciousness. States' rights versus federal power, a fundamental American debate. From the birth of the United States, a central question haunted the new republic. Should ultimate authority rest with the national government or with the individual states? The Constitution attempted to balance these competing visions, but the issue was never fully settled. Over time, the struggle between states' rights and federal power became especially contentious in the South, where states increasingly used the doctrine of local sovereignty to defend slavery and resist federal authority. This debate escalated into crises that threatened national unity and laid the ideological foundation for secession and civil war. Jeffersonian and Jacksonian ideas. Two of the most influential early American presidents, Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, shaped the ideology of states' rights, though in very different contexts and with varying implications. Jeffersonian republicanism. Thomas Jefferson, the third president and author of the Declaration of Independence, was a staunch believer in limited federal government and state sovereignty. Jefferson feared centralized power would lead to tyranny, much like the monarchy the colonies had overthrown. His Democratic Republican Party advocated for an agrarian republic based on independent farmers, decentralized authority, and a narrow interpretation of the Constitution. Opposition to a strong national bank or expansive federal programs. Jefferson's response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, 1798, helped define the concept of states' rights. In the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, Jefferson and James Madison argued that states could nullify unconstitutional federal laws, a radical claim that would echo in later Southern arguments. Jacksonian democracy. Andrew Jackson, president from 1829 to 1837, was also a champion of the common man and skeptical of elite institutions. Jackson distrusted national banks and supported expanding political power to white male voters, regardless of property ownership. While Jackson upheld state authority in many areas, he famously clashed with South Carolina during the Nullification Crisis, a confrontation that revealed the tension within Jacksonian principles. Jackson's presidency was a paradox. He expanded executive power, yet claimed to defend local autonomy. His actions laid bare the limits of states' rights when they threatened national unity. A nullification crisis. South Carolina's rebellion. The Nullification Crisis, 1832 to 1833, was one of the earliest and most dramatic confrontations over states' rights, centered on tariffs and Southern resistance to federal economic policy. Tariff dispute. The Tariff of 1828, dubbed the Tariff of Abominations by its Southern critics, imposed high duties on imported goods to protect Northern industries. Southern states, especially South Carolina, felt the tariff unfairly targeted their economy, which depended on imported goods and cotton exports. South Carolina's response, led by John C. Calhoun, a powerful Southern politician, and Jackson's own vice president, South Carolina argued that the federal tariff was unconstitutional. A state had the right to nullify federal laws it deemed invalid. If forced to comply, South Carolina would secede from the Union. Jackson's reaction. Despite his support for limited government, Jackson rejected nullification as a threat to national authority. In 1833, he secured passage of the Force Bill, authorizing the use of military power to enforce federal law. At the same time, Congress passed a compromise tariff, easing tensions. The crisis ended peacefully, but the idea of nullification and secession was now embedded in Southern political doctrine. It was clear, when federal authority clashed with slavery and economic interests, states' rights would become the rallying cry for Southern resistance. Southern arguments defending states' rights. As the North grew in population, political influence, and anti-slavery sentiment, the South increasingly viewed federal power as a direct threat to its way of life, especially slavery. Political justifications. Southern leaders argued that the Constitution was a compact between sovereign states, not a grant of unlimited power to a central government. Therefore, states had the right to withdraw from the Union if the federal government overstepped its constitutional bounds. This argument would later be used to justify secession in 1860 to 1861. Defense of slavery. States' rights became synonymous with the right to maintain slavery. Southerners insisted the federal government had no authority to restrict slavery in the territories, interfere with slaveholder rights across state lines, e.g., via the Fugitive Slave Clause, abolish slavery without violating state sovereignty. In effect, states' rights were used selectively. Southern leaders supported national power when it protected slavery, e.g., enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, but invoked states' rights to resist anti-slavery policies. Growing national control versus local autonomy. As America expanded and centralized, conflicts between federal and state authority intensified. Federal power expands. The federal government began to assert greater control over territorial expansion and the status of slavery in new lands, interstate commerce, infrastructure, and economic regulation. The enforcement of national laws, even in states that opposed them. Northern views. Many in the North came to believe that slavery was a moral evil and that the federal government had a duty to limit or end it. Abolitionists and moderate Republicans increasingly supported national legislation to block slavery's spread. Southern backlash. The South viewed these developments as proof of a Northern conspiracy to dominate national politics and destroy Southern society. By the 1850s, many Southerners believed that only complete independence could preserve their rights, especially the right to hold slaves. Conclusion: a nation at odds with itself. The long-standing debate between states' rights and federal authority became a key ideological battleground in antebellum America. What began as a constitutional disagreement over the scope of government turned into a philosophical and existential divide between North and South. In the North, federal power came to be seen as a tool for progress, reform, and unity. In the South, it was increasingly viewed as an instrument of oppression. As the federal government grew more assertive, especially on issues related to slavery, Southern states clung more tightly to states' rights as a shield for their institutions and values. Ultimately, when Southern leaders concluded that their rights, particularly the right to maintain slavery, could no longer be secured within the Union, they turned to the ultimate expression of state sovereignty: secession. Missouri Compromise and Kansas-Nebraska Act. 1. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, a temporary balance. As the United States expanded westward, the question of whether slavery would be permitted in new territories threatened to shatter the fragile peace between North and South. The first major crisis erupted in 1819, when the Missouri Territory applied for statehood as a slave state. At the time, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states, creating a balance in the U.S. Senate. Missouri's admission threatened to tip the scale in favor of the South, alarming Northern lawmakers who feared a pro-slavery majority. To avoid disunion, Congress passed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, brokered by Henry Clay. The terms included: Missouri would be admitted as a slave state. Maine, previously part of Massachusetts, would be admitted as a free state, maintaining Senate ballots. Slavery would be prohibited north of latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes in the remainder of the Louisiana Territory, with the exception of Missouri. This compromise temporarily diffused tensions and established a geographic boundary for slavery's expansion. However, it only postponed the inevitable conflict and failed to address deeper moral and political divisions. The Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Law. 3 decades later, the U.S. faced another sectional crisis, following its victory in the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, which added vast new territories in the West. The central question returned: would slavery expand into the new territories? The Compromise of 1850, another effort led by Henry Clay, included several key provisions. California was admitted as a free state. The slave trade, but not slavery, was abolished in Washington, D.C. The Fugitive Slave Act was strengthened, requiring all citizens, including those in free states, to assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. The status of slavery in Utah and New Mexico territories would be decided by popular sovereignty, letting settlers vote. While the compromise delayed conflict, the new fugitive slave law infuriated Northerners. It required them to participate in a system they increasingly viewed as immoral and unjust. Resistance to the law through activism, legal challenges, and the Underground Railroad further heightened tensions. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, repealing the Missouri Compromise. The fragile peace collapsed with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, introduced by Senator Stephen A. Douglas. The act created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, repealed the Missouri Compromise line 36 degrees 30 minutes, allowed settlers to decide the issue of slavery by popular sovereignty. The bill was seen in the South as a victory, but provoked outrage in the North. It opened land once guaranteed as free to the possibility of slavery and reignited fierce national debate. Bleeding Kansas and the collapse of compromise. Almost immediately, Kansas became a violent battleground. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into the territory, each hoping to sway the vote. The result was a period of bloody conflict known as Bleeding Kansas, 1854 to 1859. Armed clashes erupted between pro-slavery militias and free soilers. In 1856, abolitionist John Brown led a raid in retaliation for pro-slavery violence. Rival governments formed, one pro-slavery, one anti-slavery, plunging the region into chaos. Bleeding Kansas revealed that popular sovereignty was unworkable and that legislative compromises could no longer contain the sectional crisis. The collapse of the Missouri Compromise's boundary removed the last vestiges of national consensus on slavery's expansion and pushed the nation closer to civil war. Dred Scott Decision 1. Background of the case. The case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857, emerged from a long legal battle that began in the Missouri courts. Dred Scott was an enslaved African-American man who had lived with his enslaver, Dr. John Emerson, in several free territories, including Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory, now Minnesota, where slavery was prohibited under the Missouri Compromise. After Emerson's death, Scott sued for his freedom in 1846, arguing that because he had lived in free territory, he was legally free. The case went through multiple appeals before finally reaching the U.S. Supreme Court, where it became a national flashpoint in the sectional struggle over slavery. Supreme Court ruling and its national impact. In 1857, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, issued a sweeping and controversial decision. In a 7-2 ruling, the court denied Scott his freedom and issued judgments with far-reaching consequences. The ruling included 3 key points. African Americans were not citizens and therefore could not sue in federal court. Residence in a free state or territory did not make an enslaved person free. The Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, as Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. By declaring the Missouri Compromise void, the court opened all Western territories to the potential spread of slavery, even those that had been considered permanently free. This decision nullified decades of political compromise, enraged Northern abolitionists, and emboldened Southern pro-slavery factions. Taney's opinion, African Americans not citizens. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, a former slaveholder from Maryland, wrote the majority opinion. His reasoning was deeply rooted in racism and reflected Southern ideology. Taney argued that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. He claimed that at the time of the Constitution's drafting, Black people were not intended to be included as citizens and could not claim any constitutional protections. The opinion framed enslaved individuals purely as property, invoking the Fifth Amendment to argue that depriving someone of their slaves in federal territories was an unconstitutional seizure of property. Taney's ruling not only denied freedom to Dred Scott, but also stripped all Black Americans, even those living free in the North, of any claim to U.S. citizenship. Northern outrage and legal political fallout. The Dred Scott decision sent shockwaves throughout the North. Many Northerners, including moderates who had not previously supported abolition, were outraged by the ruling's implications. The decision invalidated decades of federal efforts to limit slavery's expansion. It threatened the legal status of free Black communities in northern states. Abolitionists and newly formed Republicans saw the ruling as proof that the slave power had seized control of the federal government. One rising political figure, Abraham Lincoln, publicly denounced the decision, warning that it was part of a larger effort to nationalize slavery. His opposition to the Dred Scott ruling became a central part of his arguments during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, 1858, and laid the groundwork for his presidential campaign in 1860. In conclusion, a nation further divided. The Dred Scott decision was one of the most consequential and inflammatory Supreme Court rulings in American history. Rather than settling the issue of slavery in the territories, it deepened sectional divisions, undermined the possibility of compromise, and accelerated the path to civil war. By denying the rights of African Americans and invalidating federal authority to limit slavery, the court aligned itself with Southern slaveholders and alienated much of the North. In doing so, it turned the judicial branch into a battlefield in the fight over the future of American freedom. John Brown's Raid on Harper's Ferry, 1859. Introduction, A Nation on the Brink. By the late 1850s, tensions between North and South had reached a boiling point. Slavery was not only a political issue, it had become a moral battleground that fractured the national conscience. Against this backdrop, one man decided to act. John Brown, a radical abolitionist who believed that slavery was a sin that could only be eradicated through force. His raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859 was an explosive episode that terrified the South, thrilled many in the North, and became a powerful symbol of the deepening national divide. John Brown, the man and his mission, early life and religious convictions. John Brown was born in 1800 in Torrington, Connecticut, into a deeply religious and anti-slavery family. His father, Owen Brown, was a devout Calvinist who taught his children that slavery was a grave moral evil. This belief formed the bedrock of John Brown's worldview. Unlike many abolitionists who fought slavery through speeches, literature, and legal activism, Brown was convinced that the system would only fall through direct action. He saw himself as a modern-day Moses, tasked by God to liberate the enslaved, even if it required violence. Brown's understanding of Christianity was militant. He believed that shedding blood was necessary, even righteous, in the cause of freedom. Bleeding Kansas and radicalization. Brown's radicalism was sharpened during the conflict known as Bleeding Kansas, 1854 to 1856, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed over whether Kansas would enter the Union as a slave or free state. In 1856, Brown and his followers killed 5 pro-slavery settlers in the Potawatomi Massacre, an event that shocked the nation and confirmed Brown's willingness to use deadly force. To his supporters, he was a warrior for justice. To his enemies, a terrorist. Planning the raid. Vision of a slave insurrection. A. The grand strategy. Brown envisioned a daring plan. Seize the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, arm enslaved people in the surrounding area, and spark a widespread slave uprising that would spread across the South, dismantling slavery from within. He believed that once the first enslaved people were liberated and armed, others would follow, rising in a mass revolt. He saw the Appalachian Mountains as a natural stronghold for launching a prolonged guerrilla war against slaveholders. B. Support and secrecy. To fund his mission, Brown courted influential Northern abolitionists, later called the Secret Six, including Theodore Parker, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and Gerrit Smith. These men provided money, weapons, and moral encouragement, though many later denied knowledge of Brown's exact plans. In preparation, Brown rented a farmhouse in Maryland, just a few miles from Harper's Ferry. He stockpiled weapons and gathered a group of 21 followers, including both white and black men, several of his own sons, and 2 fugitive slaves. The raid. Harper's Ferry, October 1859. A. The attack begins. On the night of October 16, 1859, Brown and his men crossed the Potomac River into Harper's Ferry. They quickly captured the federal armory, arsenal, and the railroad bridge. Several hostages were taken, including Colonel Lewis Washington, great-grandnephew of George Washington. At first, the raid went surprisingly well. Brown believed that local enslaved people would immediately join the rebellion, but that did not happen. The expected uprising failed to materialize. B. Local resistance and federal response. News of the attack spread rapidly. By morning, Virginia militia and townspeople had surrounded Brown's small force. A standoff ensued. By October 18th, the federal government, under President James Buchanan, dispatched U.S. Marines led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, who would later command the Confederate Army. The Marines stormed the engine house, now called John Brown's Fort, where Brown was holed up with the remaining survivors. In a matter of minutes, they crushed the resistance. Brown was wounded and captured. 10 of his men were killed, including 2 of his sons, and 7 others were captured. Trial and execution, martyr or madman. A. Legal proceedings. Brown was swiftly indicted for murder, inciting a slave insurrection, and treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia. His trial was held in Charlestown, close to Harper's Ferry, under tight security due to fears of rescue attempts or Northern retaliation. Despite his injuries, Brown participated fully in the proceedings. He used the courtroom as a platform to justify his actions. He denied he intended to commit violence against civilians and insisted he acted only to liberate the enslaved. B. Final words and execution. On December 2nd, 1859, Brown was hanged. His last written words, passed to a jailer, read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood." These words would prove prophetic. His stoic demeanor, calm under pressure, and unflinching belief in justice impressed many Northerners, who began to recast him as a martyr rather than a crime. National reaction. Shockwaves across the country. A. Northern admiration. While mainstream politicians condemned the raid as illegal and dangerous, many Northern abolitionists were deeply moved. Henry David Thoreau, for example, compared Brown to Jesus Christ and Socrates, praising his moral courage. Brown became a symbol of self-sacrifice and resistance, especially among radical abolitionists and African Americans. Church bells rang in Northern towns. Memorial services were held. The image of John Brown, gaunt and defiant, entered American mythology. B. Southern horror and panic. To the South, John Brown was no hero. He was a terrorist, a madman, and a murderer. His raids struck at the heart of Southern fears, slave rebellion. The idea that armed Northerners might inspire enslaved people to rise up terrified slaveholders. Southern newspapers warned of widespread Northern conspiracies. Militant rhetoric increased. The slave power began arming itself. Militias formed. Forts were. Collapse of trust. The raid on Harper's Ferry marked a fundamental shift. Southerners no longer trusted the federal government to protect their interests. They viewed the Republican Party, though not directly involved in the raid, as morally aligned with Brown's goals. When Abraham Lincoln, a Republican who opposed slavery's expansion, was elected in 1860, many in the South saw it as confirmation that violent emancipation was the North's hidden agenda. B. Birth of Southern militancy. Brown's raid catalyzed the militarization of the South. In the months following the attack, Southern states passed laws to increase state militia funding. Slave patrols intensified. Secessionist rhetoric surged among Southern leaders who claimed they could no longer remain in a union that tolerated such fanaticism. The raid also widened the gap within the North. Moderates feared Brown's tactics, but more and more people were coming to believe that slavery was incompatible with the idea. John Brown's legacy. A. Symbol of resistance. John Brown's raid failed militarily, but succeeded symbolically. It forced the nation to confront the violence inherent in slavery and raised uncomfortable questions about justice, morality, and rebellion. The song John Brown's Body became a Union marching tune during the Civil War, later rewritten as the Battle Hymn of the Republic. His image was emblazoned in Northern newspapers, poems, sermons, and songs. B. Historical debate. Historians continue to debate Brown's legacy. Was he a terrorist who used unjustifiable violence, or a freedom fighter ahead of his time? Was he a madman or a prophet? What is clear is that Brown's actions shattered illusions of peaceful compromise. His raid didn't just ignite a building, it ignited a nation. Conclusion. The fire next time. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry stands as a turning point in American history. It showed that moral outrage over slavery had reached a point where words were no longer enough for some. It terrified the South, galvanized the North, and made war seem inevitable. As historian David Blight wrote, John Brown planted the seeds of emancipation, but he watered them in blood. The raid did not destroy slavery, but it forced America to reckon with it. And in doing so, it lit a fuse that would explode in civil war just 2 years later. Abraham Lincoln's election, 1860. The spark that lit the fire. The political landscape in 1860, a nation on the edge. By 1860, the United States was gripped by crisis. For decades, the issue of slavery had divided North and South, poisoned congressional debates, sparked violence in territories like Kansas, and created a chasm of mutual distrust. With the presidency up for grabs that year, the election became a referendum on slavery's future and the future of the Union itself. The major national parties, once bastions of compromise, were themselves falling apart under sectional pressures. The election of 1860 became a four-way race that reflected the fractured soul of the country. The fragmented parties, the Democratic Party, long the dominant force in American politics, split into Northern and Southern factions over slavery. Northern Democrats, led by Stephen A. Douglas, supported popular sovereignty, the idea that each territory should decide for itself whether to allow slavery. Southern Democrats, furious over Douglas's moderation, broke away and nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. He supported federal protection for slavery in all U.S. territories. The Republican Party, founded in the mid-1850s, had risen rapidly in the North. Its base was made up of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and abolitionists. They nominated Abraham Lincoln, a relatively unknown lawyer and former congressman from Illinois, whose debates with Stephen Douglas had brought him national fame. A fourth group, calling themselves the Constitutional Union Party, emerged from the remains of the Whig Party and conservative Southern moderates. They nominated John Bell of Tennessee and avoided the slavery issue altogether, hoping to preserve the Union by promoting the Constitution and rule of law. B. Regional tensions in the electorate. The election map in 1860 was not national. It was sectional. The North and West leaned heavily Republican, favoring free labor and the prevention of slavery's expansion. The South, seeing slavery as essential to its economy and culture, gravitated toward Breckinridge or Bell, deeply mistrustful of Lincoln and the Republicans. The stage was set for an electoral showdown that would determine the fate of the United States. The Republican platform: stop the spread, not immediate abolition. Despite Southern fears, the Republican Party in 1860 did not call for the abolition of slavery where it already existed. Instead, its primary goal was to prevent the spread of slavery into new territories. A. Key tenets of the Republican platform: no expansion of slavery into the Western territories, support for a protective tariff to promote American industry, free homesteads in the West for settlers, internal improvements such as a transcontinental railroad. The slavery issue, however, overshadowed all others. Republicans believed that if slavery were confined to the South, it would eventually wither away. They argued that the Western territories should be reserved for free white labor. Lincoln's moderate stance. Abraham Lincoln was chosen in part because he was moderate, not radical. While personally opposed to slavery, he did not call for its immediate abolition. He assured the South repeatedly that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, but he refused to support its expansion. In a famous line from one of his debates with Douglas, Lincoln had said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free." To the South, this was proof that Lincoln and the Republicans would eventually destroy slavery entirely. Southern perception of Lincoln: a direct threat to their way of life. In the Southern imagination, Lincoln's election represented not just a political defeat, it was an existential threat. A. The Southern worldview. The Southern economy was entirely dependent on slavery. Cotton was king, and enslaved labor powered the plantation system. But slavery was also deeply embedded in Southern society, politics, religion, and racial ideology. Southern leaders feared that if slavery were not allowed to expand, it would become economically unsustainable. Free states would outnumber slave states and dominate Congress, eventually passing constitutional amendments to abolish slavery. The Republican Party, despite its moderation, was a Northern tool that aimed to abolish the Southern way of life. Southern newspapers portrayed Lincoln as a black Republican radical, and some claimed his election would lead to race mixing, slave revolts, and the collapse of white supremacy. The failure of trust. Even though Lincoln had not yet taken office, Southern states were already planning for secession. To them, his election proved the Union had become dominated by anti-slavery forces, and they believed the constitutional system had failed to protect their rights. They viewed Lincoln's presidency not as a transition, but as a takeover. The election results. A sectional victory. A. Electoral and popular vote breakdown. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidency with 180 electoral votes, a clear majority of 152 needed, 39.8% of the popular vote. But here's the key. Lincoln did not win a single Southern state. In fact, he wasn't even on the ballot in 10 Southern states. His support was entirely Northern and Western. The other candidates. Stephen Douglas received 29.5% of the popular vote, but only 12 electoral votes. John Breckinridge won most of the South and secured 72 electoral votes. John Bell won 3 border states and received 39 electoral votes. The results confirmed what many feared. The United States was now 2 separate political nations sharing one flag. Secession. The immediate fallout of Lincoln's victory. South Carolina leads the way. Within 6 weeks of Lincoln's election, South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th, 1860. Its ordinance of secession declared, "The government of the United States has become destructive to the purposes for which it was ordained." South Carolina's leaders accused Lincoln of threatening slavery and trampling on state sovereignty. They believed secession was both a right and a necessity. B. The secession cascade. Over the next few months, 6 more states followed. Mississippi, January 9th, 1861. Florida, January 10th. Alabama, January 11th. Georgia, January 19th. Louisiana, January 26. Texas, February 1st. These states formed the Confederate States of America in February 1861, even before Lincoln was inaugurated. They selected Jefferson Davis as their president and adopted a constitution that guaranteed slavery's protection. Lincoln's silence and strategy. As president-elect, Lincoln refused to make any public promises or policy statements. He believed that any compromise would be seen as weakness and encourage more demands. He also did not believe secession was legal. In his inaugural address in March 1861, he stated, "The Union is perpetual. No state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union." However, he also said he would not invade the South unless first attacked. This delicate balance would be shattered a month later when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, starting the Civil War. The election of 1860, a turning point in American history. A. The end of the middle ground. Lincoln's election ended decades of compromise. No longer could politicians delay the slavery question or paper over differences. The North and South had chosen different futures, and the nation could no longer contain both. The election revealed the power of the North. which had grown in population and political strength. The fear of the South. That without political balance, slavery would be doomed. The collapse of national parties with regional loyalties taking their place. B. A revolution in political geography. For the first time, a party had won the presidency with no support from the South. This proved to the South that it was politically marginalized and that the national government could move forward without it. That realization, combined with decades of grievance and fear, led directly to the disunion of the United States. Conclusion: the calm before the storm. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 was more than just a political victory. It was the culmination of sectional tensions, partisan collapse, and ideological division. Though Lincoln took a moderate stance, the South saw in him the embodiment of Northern aggression. His election marked the final break in an already fractured nation. The secession of Southern states began before he even took office, and the slide toward war became unstoppable. As the sun set on 1860, the American experiment hung by a thread. The presidency of a tall, soft-spoken lawyer from Illinois would soon be tested by the bloodiest war in American history. The road to war, secession, begins. South Carolina leads the way. By December 1860, the United States was at a tipping point. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a Republican who opposed the expansion of slavery, was seen by Southern leaders as a direct threat to their way of life and political influence. South Carolina, long a hotbed of secessionist sentiment, became the first state to act. On December 20th, 1860, its convention passed an ordinance of secession, declaring that the union between South Carolina and the other states was dissolved. South Carolina justified its decision through a secession declaration that echoed the language of the Declaration of Independence, claiming the federal government had violated its constitutional obligations, particularly by failing to protect slaveholders' rights. This argument rested on a theory of states' rights that allowed for the legal withdrawal from the Union, a theory rooted in Southern constitutional interpretation and bolstered by historical grievances such as the Tariff of Abominations and the Nullification Crisis. In the immediate aftermath of South Carolina's bold move, a wave of secession swept across the Deep South. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas seceded between January and February 1861. These states shared common motivations: a fear of abolitionist ascendancy, the preservation of slavery, and resentment toward Northern dominance in federal affairs. The secession crisis plunged the nation into chaos. Outgoing President James Buchanan insisted that secession was illegal, but also that the federal government had no constitutional authority to coerce a state back into the Union. This inaction only emboldened the secessionists and left the critical months before Lincoln's inauguration in limbo. Formation of the Confederate States. On February 4, 1861, delegates from the seceded states convened in Montgomery, Alabama, to create a new nation, the Confederate States of America, CSA. In only a few days, they crafted a provisional constitution, drawing heavily from the U.S. Constitution, but with several key differences. The Confederate Constitution emphasized state sovereignty, explicitly protected the institution of slavery, and limited federal authority. On February 9th, the convention unanimously elected Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator from Mississippi and Secretary of War, as the provisional president. Alexander H. Stephens of Georgia was chosen as vice president. Davis had initially opposed secession, but once it became reality, he accepted the leadership role and vowed to defend the South's independence. The new government quickly moved to assert its legitimacy by establishing administrative offices, raising an army, and seeking recognition from foreign nations. Meanwhile, the remaining southern slave states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Missouri, had not yet seceded, hoping for compromise or at least for the North to make the first aggressive move. The Confederacy claimed it sought peace and independence, not war. But its seizure of federal forts, arsenals, and custom houses within its territory provoked mounting tension. Both sides were now in a dangerous standoff. Fort Sumter and the war's outbreak. The standoff between North and South reached a flashpoint in Charleston Harbor, where Fort Sumter, a federal fort manned by U.S. troops under Major Robert Anderson, became the symbolic and strategic test case for Lincoln's resolve. After his inauguration on March 4, 1861, Lincoln declared he would not initiate war, but would hold, occupy, and possess federal property in the South. The Confederacy, however, viewed any federal presence within its claimed territory as an act of aggression. Fort Sumter, surrounded by Confederate artillery, was running low on supplies. Lincoln faced a dilemma: resupply the fort and risk provoking war, or abandon it and appear weak, undermining his authority and Union resolve. On April 6, Lincoln notified South Carolina's governor that he would send a non-military relief expedition to resupply the fort. The Confederate leadership, led by Davis and his Secretary of War, Leroy P. Walker, decided to act before the supplies arrived. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 a.m., Confederate forces under General P.G.T. Beauregard opened fire on Fort Sumter. After 34 hours of bombardment, Anderson surrendered. There were no deaths during the actual bombardment, but the attack electrified the North. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, marking the official beginning of the American Civil War. This move caused a domino effect. Virginia, one of the most populous and influential southern states, seceded on April 17th, followed soon by Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. The war was now fully underway. Early Northern and Southern strategies. In the initial months of war, both the Union and Confederacy devised ambitious but flawed strategies based on their respective strengths and limitations. Northern strategy, the Anaconda Plan. The Union, under General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, developed the Anaconda Plan, a long-term strategy to economically strangle the South. Its key components included naval blockade, surround and cut off southern ports to prevent trade and resupply, control of the Mississippi River, divide the Confederacy in two and cut off internal supply lines, capture Richmond, take the Confederate capital to break political cohesion. Though mocked initially for its slow-moving nature, the Anaconda Plan would form the backbone of Union strategy throughout the war. However, Lincoln and his advisors also sought a quick military victory, believing a single strong blow could end the rebellion early. Southern strategy, defensive war, and foreign recognition. The Confederacy strategy relied on its vast size, commitment to defending homeland soil, and hoped for support from European powers, particularly Britain and France, whose textile industries depended on Southern cotton. Confederate leaders believed that a defensive war of attrition, combined with a few strategic offensives, could exhaust Northern will and resources. They also counted on internal divisions in the North and war weariness to force a political settlement. Confederate generals like Robert E. Lee and Joseph E. Johnston advocated a strategy of protecting critical railroads and ports while also being flexible enough to seize the initiative when opportunity arose. The South also attempted early offensives, such as the invasion of Kentucky and efforts to bring border states into the Confederacy. These efforts had mixed success and sometimes backfired by driving neutral states toward the Union cause.